At the cabin my daughter left me, I found her hidden letter saying, "Marcus has been stealing millions from elderly clients and I think he's going to kill me." That's when I called the police. My name is Raymond Mitchell, and I'm a 54-year-old former forensic accountant who spent 30 years investigating financial fraud for the FBI. What Marcus didn't know when he murdered my daughter Sarah was that I'd built my career dismantling exactly the kind of schemes he was running. He thought he was dealing with a grieving father who'd lost everything. He had no idea he'd just handed evidence to someone who specialized in destroying people like him. 3 weeks earlier, I'd sat in that lawyer's office watching Marcus inherit Sarah's $12 million estate, while I got what seemed like a worthless mountain cabin. Marcus and his mother Patricia had made their contempt clear, laughing about my appropriate inheritance, suggesting I needed help with basic tasks, treating me like a broken old man who couldn't manage his own affairs. "Properties like that can deteriorate quickly," Marcus had said with his practiced smile. "Sometimes it's better to cut your losses early." What he didn't realize was that those words revealed everything. He was already planning to control what happened to that cabin, which meant he suspected there might be something valuable there. In 30 years of fraud investigation, I'd learned that criminals always tell you exactly what they're afraid of. The drive to Pine Ridge Road took me through mountain terrain that reminded me of surveillance operations I'd run in my federal days. Remote locations, difficult access, perfect for hiding evidence. When I found the cabin, it looked exactly like what I'd expected. A deliberate facade designed to discourage casual visitors while protecting something important. Inside, the cabin was strategically empty except for one piece of furniture that didn't belong. A high-quality oak desk with brass fittings, the kind Sarah would choose. Every instinct I'd developed hunting financial criminals told me this desk was the real reason I'd inherited this property. The locked drawer confirmed my suspicions. During my FBI years, I'd seen hundreds of evidence caches, and Sarah had constructed this one with the precision of someone who understood how investigations work. The key hidden in the back corner, the manila folders organized chronologically, the digital recordings properly labeled and stored. My daughter had documented Marcus's crimes with the thoroughness of a federal agent. Her letter hit me like a physical blow, not just because of the content, but because of what it revealed about Marcus's manipulation. Every distant conversation, every missed call, every time Sarah had seemed cold or uninterested, it had all been orchestrated. Marcus had systematically isolated her from me, using the same techniques I'd seen cult leaders and financial predators employ with their victims. But Sarah's evidence was even more devastating than her letter. As I spread the documents across her desk, I realized I was looking at a multi-million-dollar elder fraud operation that would have taken years to build. Bank statements showing systematic theft from elderly clients, email chains detailing money laundering through offshore accounts, handwritten notes profiling victims based on their vulnerabilities. Eleanor Whitman, 83, with no family nearby. $2 million, stolen down to $30,000. Harold Thompson, 91, with early dementia. $1, Jacite. Million disappeared through forged authorizations. Martha Stevens, 74, with diabetes and a daughter who only checked her accounts monthly. Everything except Social Security gone. The email exchanges between Marcus and his partner, David Kellerman, read like a federal case file. Use the same shell company structure as last time. Eleanor is asking questions. We need to move faster. These old people are too confused to cause real problems. But it was Sarah's handwritten journal that revealed the true scope of Marcus's criminality. She'd documented his escalating paranoia, his drug use, his violent threats when he suspected she was investigating him. The final entry, dated 1 week before her death, was chilling. Marcus came home early and found me in his office. He grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. I saw something in his eyes, something cold. I think he's going to kill me. The digital recorder contained the smoking gun. Marcus discussing his murder plan with clinical detachment. I've been putting small amounts of antifreeze in her coffee. In a few weeks she'll have an accident. Maybe she'll fall down the stairs. These things happen. My FBI training took over immediately. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. This was a federal crime scene involving interstate fraud, money laundering, and premeditated murder. I had evidence that could destroy Marcus completely. but only if I handled it with the same strategic precision I'd used in federal investigations. My first call was to Linda, my sister in Phoenix, but not for emotional support, for operational security. Linda had worked 20 years in federal law enforcement communications, and I needed someone who understood how to document and preserve evidence chains properly. "Ray," she said immediately upon answering, "you sound different. What's happened?" I outlined the situation with the same clinical precision I'd once used briefing assistant directors. Linda's response confirmed she understood the implications. "This is massive, Ray. Interstate fraud, elder abuse, murder. You're looking at decades of federal charges, but you need to be careful. If Marcus suspects what you found, he'll run or try to destroy evidence." My second call was to Detective Barbara Hayes, but I approached it strategically. Rather than appearing desperate or emotional, I presented myself as a retired federal agent with evidence of a major financial crime. The shift in her tone was immediate. "Mr. Mitchell, if what you're describing is accurate, we're talking about one of the largest elder fraud cases in state history. I'm sending a full team to that location." When Hayes arrived with 3 officers and a crime scene technician, I had Sarah's evidence laid out like a federal briefing. Bank statements in chronological order, email chains organized by criminal activity, audio and video files properly indexed. This wasn't the presentation of a grieving father. This was the work product of someone who'd spent decades building cases that destroyed criminal enterprises. Officer Jackson, reviewing the audio recordings, went pale when he reached Marcus's discussion of poisoning Sarah. "Detective, this is premeditated murder. We have the method, motive, and opportunity all documented." Detective Hayes was equally stunned by the financial evidence. "Jesus, Mr. Mitchell, this is systematic. 15 separate victims over 3 years, total theft exceeding $10 million. We'll need to coordinate with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit." "Already contacted them," I said, handing her a business card. "Special Agent Jennifer Blake. She's expecting your call. I worked with her on the Sanderson pension fraud case 2 years ago." Hayes stared at the card, suddenly understanding she wasn't dealing with an ordinary civilian. "You investigated the Sanderson case? That was a $100 million scheme. $140 million, actually. Sarah documented her evidence using some of the same techniques I taught federal agents. She knew exactly what she was doing. What I didn't tell Hayes was that I'd already activated additional resources Marcus couldn't possibly anticipate. My 30 years investigating financial crimes had built relationships across multiple federal agencies. By the time we arrested Marcus, he'd faced coordinated charges in 3 states plus federal court. Marcus's afternoon visit to my apartment confirmed he suspected something, but his approach revealed how completely he'd underestimated his opponent. He came with the same patronizing attitude he'd shown at the will reading, expecting to manipulate a broken old man into compliance. "Sarah always worried about you living alone," he lied smoothly. "Maybe it's time to consider something with more assistance." I let him perform his act while making mental notes of every manipulation technique he employed. The false concern, the financial implications, the subtle threats. Classic predatory behavior I'd seen hundreds of times in federal interrogation rooms. When he mentioned the cabin, his mask slipped just enough to reveal his desperation. Properties like that can deteriorate quickly if they're not maintained. Sometimes it's better to cut your losses early. Perfect. He'd just provided additional evidence of intent to obstruct justice, probably recorded by the surveillance equipment Detective Hayes had placed in my apartment earlier that day. "You're being very generous, Marcus," I said, maintaining the facade of confused helplessness. "But I think I can manage." His eyes went cold when he realized I wouldn't be easily manipulated. The confident businessman disappeared, replaced by someone calculating whether I represented a threat worth eliminating. After he left, I immediately contacted Hayes with a tactical assessment. "He's rattled. Suspect is likely to accelerate timeline for evidence destruction or flight. Recommend immediate arrest before he can access offshore accounts." "We're executing warrants at 3 a.m., Hayes confirmed. Federal marshals are coordinating to freeze his financial assets simultaneously. The arrest went exactly as I'd predicted. Marcus was caught packing for flight with $200,000 in cash and detailed plans for accessing Cayman Islands accounts. The search of his residence revealed additional evidence I hadn't even known existed, more victim files, boxes of forged documents, and the antifreeze he'd used to poison Sarah. But the most satisfying discovery was Marcus's own video recordings. He'd been documenting his crimes, apparently for his own entertainment. The footage of him discussing Sarah's murder just days after her funeral was particularly damning. "Raymond's completely clueless," he'd bragged to someone on the phone. "Sarah barely spoke to him the last few years. I made sure of that. Even if he suspected something, who would believe him?" Detective Hayes showed me that video with something approaching reverence. "Mr. Mitchell, in 20 years of police work, I've never seen evidence this comprehensive. Between your daughter's files and what we found at his house, Marcus is looking at life without parole. The federal charges came down exactly as I'd anticipated: elder fraud, money laundering, interstate transportation of stolen funds, tax evasion, and first-degree murder. Agent Blake, my former colleague, personally delivered the indictment." "Ray, this is beautiful work," she said, reviewing Sarah's evidence files. "She documented everything like she'd been trained by the Bureau. Did you teach her these techniques?" "She learned by watching me work cases at home," I said, remembering Sarah as a teenager, fascinated by financial investigations. "I never imagined she'd need to use them to document her own murder. The trial was a masterclass in federal prosecution. Marcus's defense team tried to portray him as a grieving husband whose business practices had been misunderstood. That strategy collapsed when prosecutors played his own recordings discussing Sarah's murder and his theft from elderly victims. Eleanor Whitman, now 84, testified about trusting Marcus with her life savings, only to discover he'd stolen everything. Harold Thompson's son flew in from Seattle to provide victim impact testimony after his father died, never understanding what had happened to his money. But the most devastating testimony came from Marcus's business partner, David Kellerman, who'd cooperated with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. He detailed their entire operation: how they targeted vulnerable elderly clients, forged documents, manipulated bank procedures, and laundered money through shell companies. "Marcus told me Raymond would never be a problem," Kellerman testified. "He said Sarah's father was just a sad old man with no money or influence. Marcus had convinced Sarah that her father resented her success and was becoming senile. When the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all counts, I felt the satisfaction I'd once experienced watching federal judges sentence white-collar criminals to decades in prison. Marcus received life without parole for murder, plus an additional 40 years for financial crimes. The financial investigation revealed the full scope of his theft: $15, millions stolen from 43 elderly clients across multiple states. Federal asset forfeiture recovered approximately 60%, which was distributed to victims through a court-supervised restitution process. More importantly, the publicity surrounding the case led to policy changes in how financial institutions monitor elderly accounts and report suspicious activity. Sarah's death had exposed vulnerabilities that would protect thousands of other potential victims. After the trial, I drove back to Pine Ridge Road for the final time as a federal investigator. I'd spent 6 months renovating the cabin, transforming it from Sarah's evidence cache into a comfortable mountain retreat. But I'd preserved her desk exactly as she'd left it, a memorial to her courage and the investigation skills I'd unknowingly passed on to her. The renovation had uncovered one final surprise. Hidden beneath the cabin's foundation was a safety deposit box key and instructions leading to $400,000 in emergency funds Sarah had accumulated over several years. Even while Marcus was isolating her from me, she'd been preparing for the possibility that she might need to disappear, and ensuring I'd be financially secure if something happened to her. Standing on the cabin's new deck, looking out over 12 acres of mountain forest, I understood what Sarah had really given me. Not just evidence of Marcus's crimes, but proof that love and strategic thinking could defeat even the most sophisticated predators. I had already established the Sarah Mitchell Financial Crime Victims Fund, using the life insurance money Marcus never got to claim. We'd helped 37 families recover from elder fraud, sharing the investigation techniques Sarah had documented in her final weeks. The documentary about the case had been viewed 2 million times on federal law enforcement training platforms, making Sarah's story a permanent part of how agents learn to investigate financial crimes involving family manipulation. Marcus was serving his sentence in ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison reserved for the most dangerous criminals. His appeals had been exhausted, his offshore accounts seized, his reputation destroyed. The man who'd thought he could manipulate and murder his way to wealth was spending the rest of his life in a concrete cell, with nothing but time to contemplate the magnitude of his miscalculation. He'd targeted what he thought was a vulnerable elderly man and an isolated daughter. Instead, he'd attempted to defraud a veteran federal agent and murdered someone who'd inherited both investigative instincts and access to federal resources he never imagined. That evening, I sat at Sarah's desk reading a letter from Patricia, Marcus's mother, who'd requested permission to visit the cabin. She wanted to apologize for the cruelty she'd shown at the will reading and to understand how she'd been manipulated by her own son. I'd agreed to meet her, not out of forgiveness, but from professional understanding. Marcus had victimized his own mother just as systematically as he'd victimized his elderly clients. She deserved to understand how financial predators operate, even within families. Tomorrow, I'd continue the work Sarah had made possible. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had offered me a consulting position, training agents in elder fraud investigation. At 54, I was beginning a new career built on the foundation my daughter had laid, with her courage and her death. But tonight, I simply sat surrounded by the evidence of love that no amount of criminal manipulation could destroy. Sarah had died protecting people she'd never met, ensuring justice for victims whose suffering might otherwise have been ignored, and proving that strategic thinking, combined with moral courage, could defeat even the most sophisticated evil. Marcus had tried to eliminate the two people who could expose him. Instead, he'd created a federal case that would protect elderly Americans for generations, and demonstrated that underestimating a trained investigator, even a retired one, was the last mistake a criminal career would ever make. The cabin that had seemed like cruel insult was actually the greatest gift a daughter could give her father. The chance to honor her memory by ensuring her killer faced absolute justice, and the opportunity to spend the rest of my life protecting other families from predators like Marcus. Sarah was finally at peace, Marcus was finally paying for his crimes, and I was finally home.